if the list of demands is that long and the list of supply is that short, it's not just about balancing it by adding more on the supply front. We probably need to tweak here. There's just too much. Like there's not enough minutes in the day to create enough supply to change that feeling overall. It's just too much.
I'm Amy Woodall, and this is The Conscious Habit, a show from the People Forward Network. We're teaching you how to incorporate love and consciousness at work, at home, and the world at large. You just heard from Dr. Marie-Helene Pelletier, better known to her colleagues as MH, which is also a handy little reference to mental health, so we're going to roll with that. MH brings a signature mix of business and psychology to the table. Holding both a PhD and an MBA, she translates psychology research into strategies professionals, business leaders, and their teams need to thrive. I loved our conversation about her book, The Resilience Plan, and how we can look at resilience in this practical way and really break it down just like we would any business initiative. But before we get into that, we talk about her definition of consciousness. Conscious Habit listeners, I am really thrilled to learn from our guest today. I'm thrilled for you and I'm thrilled for me because the subject of our conversation today is resilience. And our guest, Marie-Helene Pelletier, I told her I had been practicing and listening to her LinkedIn pronunciation over and over again. She's the author of The Resilience Plan. And I love her take on how we can look at strategic planning that we are so used to doing in our business and begin to incorporate that into our own wellness, our own mental health. Be sure to get your notes ready because I know we're going to take a ton of them today. Marie-Helene, or MH, as we're going to call her, welcome to the Conscious Habit Podcast.
Amy, it's such a pleasure to be here. Love even the name of your podcast. So thrilled to be here.
Thank you. If we can just teach the world how to make consciousness a habit and also resilience a habit, right? So they seem to go so hand in hand. I am anxious to hear, and out of all the guests we've ever had, I have never, ever heard the same definition twice. When you hear that word consciousness, what does it mean to you? What comes to mind?
I would say it means deliberate attention to something. So you are in the present, you are deliberately paying attention, and that puts you in a beautiful position of making choices.
Possibility. So when it comes to consciousness and resilience, which I can't wait to get into because I think there's probably a lot of myths around it too, and a lot of misnomers that you've probably had to bust over the years of what it is and what it isn't. Where is that sort of, dissection, if you will? Where's that crossing of consciousness and resilience? How do you see those two partnering together? Are they necessary? Is one necessary for the other?
I think if they were a map of words and definitions, it feels like they would be overlapping. They would be together. If we think of resilience as our ability to go through adversity and come out even stronger, and connecting this to a lot of my work, which is about being actually strategic about our resilience, that element, that importance of being strategic about our resilience really does connect with being conscious. Before we can be any kind of strategic about our resilience, we need to be very conscious about where we're at in a very realistic way, which also connects with a lot of my work, and then make choices, make decisions, make a plan, I would argue, and then things start changing.
This being strategic about resilience, really, it just speaks to me in a way that's like, oh, yeah, duh. Why had I never thought about that before? Sometimes it just feels like resilience should just be this byproduct that naturally happens. Like, I either have it or I don't. Like, I either have energy or I don't. And we make it this accidental, we kind of hope and pray that we've got it. And yet we might be depleted or burned out. Or I think what is so worse than like the worst piece of burnout is apathy. We might feel very apathetic, which is just such a terrible feeling. And so the fact that you're encouraging people to be strategic, I'd love to know, where did that start for you? Where was it where you're like, hello, can we put a plan behind this, please?
Love that you're asking this, because to the first part of what you were saying, I work a lot, mostly with professionals and leader executives, business owners, people in leadership roles of all levels. And to your point, it's as if, seriously, to get in these kinds of roles, in these kinds of positions, we have to have demonstrated a good level of resilience, at least, throughout our journey. And it gets to a point often where people around us will start saying things like, oh, Amy, you are resilient. And you hear this and you're thinking, well, yeah, I am. And you hear this over and over. You hear, oh, you're the rock of the team, rock of the family, rock of the group of friends, all these things. And you get to a point where you believe it. You believe that you are resilient as a person. And that's great. And therefore, you move on with all the rest of the things. And no, you're not paying attention, being conscious about it in any shape or form, because you assume it's part of your personality. And no, it's not. It's actually not a personality trait. It's just not. We know this from research. It is connected with some personality traits, like a tendency to be more on the optimistic side of things. But even then, resilience is something that's going to go up and down during our life, which means we can, and I would argue, really need to invest in it, influence it, increase that baseline so that when we meet even more demands, it's going to be there for us. And the way it came up is because I'm working a lot with professionals and leaders. Often they would come to me and say, MH, I don't know what my problem is. I've gone through things that are much tougher than what I'm going through right now. And I can't seem to get my head together to go through this. And if I had just said, oh, well, you need to build your resilience, they probably would have said, not interested. So I came up with that analogy. I said, wait a second, in business here, when you have a great idea about the next product or the next service, do you just have the great idea and launch? Or do you have a great idea and look at who else is offering it? What's the market for it? How much are people willing to pay for this? What forces might impact it in the near future? You do all this. You're being strategic. So the same thing here. If we're going to want to increase your resilience, we're going to need to be strategic about it. And that's how it came up.
And I'm such a believer, we say this a lot on the podcast, is how you do anything is how you do everything. And so if success is true in one area, there are ways to break it down and duplicate that. So I really appreciate, and I'm sure you've seen people, based on your share, be much more open to the idea of committing to whatever habits are required, whatever mindset shifts might be required in order to lean into resilience. There really are 4 areas of this strategic plan. Can we jump into all 4 and kind of give a high-level overview and then dive deep into a couple of these? That would be great.
Yes. What I've done is literally extracted some of the tools we use on the business side when we're doing strategic work and extracted the minimum needed here, because I know everyone is busy. No one has much extra time. So we're being realistic and efficient. So we're going to need to look at what your values are, what's most important for you in life, just like in a business, right? Are we going to launch this product? Does that align with who we are as a business? Same thing here. What are your values? Then we're looking at your sources of demands, realistically, because we tend to minimize that. Your sources of supply, because we tend to overestimate this, need to be realistic. We're going to need to look at your overall context. So the same way we would do a SWOT analysis in a business sense, here we would look at internally, what are your sources of strengths? What are things that are making your resilience challenging internally? And then externally, what in your context is actually helping and what in your context is throwing barriers. Because we've all had lists of things we could do that would help our resilience, but it's hard to implement them. And often the missing piece is this basic reflection that includes these 4 areas, and then we can create a plan.
I love that. On the values piece, if somebody's coming to you, and do they normally have theirs already identified where they're like, I know what all of my values are? Or are there some exercises and recommendations that you encourage people to go through so they can figure out what really is important to them on an individual basis?
It varies. Individuals who currently work already with a coach, for example, quite possibly have done this work more recently. So it's fresh on their radar. They have this list in mind or even on paper. And then often there is a point at which most executives and business owners have done this reflection, but sometimes it's actually a while back. And they've now been thrown into so many other demands that it's not on the radar. So it does not take that long. Take a sheet of paper, put it down here, what's most important for you in life. And I usually say, don't get hung up on, is this a value word? If you love mountains, mountains go on the list. Like, put it there. We're not being difficult. We're putting things that are most important for you.
What are yours? Do you mind sharing what are your values on your own personal resilience plan that help you kind of stay true to what's important?
Yes. And a couple of things. Number one, our values will tend to be fairly stable over time, but they can sometimes fluctuate. And just like any strategic plan in a business, when here we're going to create, say, your strategic plan, you will evolve it over time. And so it's worth revisiting your values, even if they tend to stay stable, say in 3 months from now or 6 months from now, when you're looking at the overall plan, just to see if some things may have shifted. Sometimes they may shift in, life circumstances, changes in how the family is set up and various things like that. So for me, some that tend to be fairly present and stable over time would include things like health, family, friendships, mountains, actually, it would be on mine. And then different things will come up. Recently, as I was looking at the next iteration, art was on it. And in general, Amy, you have to know, if you saw anything that I create, you'd say, well, that could be a kindergarten, perhaps, child. But for me, in this particular context, it's more to do with taking a break from other activities just to allow the brain to go in a completely different place. So some things will be stable. Some things may appear a bit more on the radar at times.
I think this is a good exercise. And we've talked about this on I have a partner who we do some co-hosting together. Her name's Desiree Garcia, and she's very strong in her values, and that health is one of her top 5 values, which means it's a non-negotiable. No matter what she does, what she says yes or no to, that knowing that she can keep her health at the forefront is always going to be the backbone of her decision making. And so I think that's such a great exercise for listeners to do if they haven't already, is what are those things that really become the backbone and the non-negotiables? Something for me for a long time in my career has been saying no to anything that would require me to miss milestones for my boys. So if it's like, oh, it's senior year, I'm not missing one game, period. Not one game he's going to play in any sport. So anything that might come in, I'm going to say no to. That's a really easy barrier. And, then as the kids kind of move off and become more independent, I'll have to figure out, how some of those things begin to shift or what that family piece begins to look like. So I like how you described that. It's fairly stable. It can shift based on life circumstances, but it sounds like they're the things that really fill us. Like they bring us some sense of joy, connection, aliveness. They make us feel better, et cetera. Is that fair?
It is fair. And we actually know from research that research on happiness, that the more we have clarity on our values and the more we can bring them in our everyday life, sometimes it's in bigger ways, but even in smaller ways, in smaller symbolic ways. And so the more our life is aligned with these values, yes, the happier we are. So absolutely, it would create that sense of connection, feeling like you're doing the right things for you in this moment in time and feeling happy.
Is there a number? 3, 5, 10, 20? Is there a magic number you recommend?
It's not a number based on research. It's a number based on my experience. I usually encourage people to try to find at least 10, because sometimes people will stop after 2 or 3, and you can work with 2 or 3, absolutely. If you give yourself just a bit more time, you may get to a bit more. And often as you push towards a bit more, like 10, for example, 10, 12, you will identify often values that were not as big and evident for you first, but they are important. Much like sometimes, that ingredient in a recipe like vanilla, which you don't need a lot of, but if you put it in, it's way better. So that's often in that effort that you're going to go find these additional ones. But sometimes, people get to 20, 25, and it's not a problem. It's more clarity, more information, more tools to play with as you create your plan in this moment.
What a great way to reflect. I think for everybody, we get so caught up in just what's the demand of the moment? Where do I need to be next? And we do get off of being strategic. And then we often are living the plan of someone else and rather than ourselves. And, several executives that I coach would come to me, especially the folks who would call themselves recovering people pleasers, would say, I've been so used to being who everyone else has needed me to be that I don't really know who do I want to be. And I think this value exercise is such a great reflection of that, of what is important to me, not just what do other people make important on my calendar. So this supply and demand, I would imagine, is this like energy time? How do people kind of figure out, was there a formula to identifying the supply and demand?
Not a formula per se. I'll tell you how I encourage people to do this. And I literally created this exercise based on the experience, what I would hear from my clients, which I'm pretty sure will resonate from your work as well. Basically, what was happening is they were saying things to me like, oh, yeah, I've got a few important, more demanding things at work going on right now, but otherwise things are mostly the same. And I'm doing, I'm taking care of myself. I am exercising and all these things. And only when I would say, okay, wait, hold on, let's stay there just a bit longer to make sure we both have really good clarity. And then we realized, the exercise needed to be done to really get to a place of having a realistic perspective. So the exercise itself, table, one sheet, two columns. One side are the demands, the other side are your sources of supply. And usually the way I encourage people to start with this is on the demand side. Okay, list, say, your top 3 work demands. That's the easiest thing. Then top 3 personal demands. Okay, let me put them. Then I say, okay, as many demands as you can add on the work front, on the personal front. Make sure you add the things that are demanding energy and you want them, because initially people go to the not so positive things that they have to do, they don't want to do. But even something that's positive, like the next massive client that will push your organization to the next level, the next promotion that you've been wanting and working for a long time. These situations still represent demands and need to be considered as such. And then on the personal side, sometimes people would hesitate to put something on the list, like a partner needing support for an important health issue. They would be like, well, I can't possibly write this. Of course I'm going to be there for my partner. And yes, you will. Yes. And it represents a demand. And it's only as you do this that you get that clarity. And we do the same exercise on the supply side, only there, instead of just saying, oh yeah, I exercised, then, well, you list the things that you've actually done in the past 2 weeks. And, past 2 weeks I've been very busy. No, didn't do that. Didn't see friends. Didn't this and that. And so then it becomes like a very skinny column. And no, I don't have a specific ratio, but because it's complex, right? It's this, but it's also this in the context of the values that you just listed 10 minutes ago. And literally people start seeing this and they have the mind to think this way. They're executives, they're business owners. They can look at the whole thing and say, okay, we've got a problem. Something needs to shift. And that, you can see it increase their consciousness of what's going on.
So under that supply, demands, I had to write it down. I was like, okay, even positive demands still count as demands. I think when we enjoy doing something, because it can simultaneously give us energy, but it can also deplete. I think 2 things can be true at the same time, right? That it might give us sort of a hint of dopamine, or, we may get something that's positive out of it, but we're still human and there's still an energy expense that's happening there. And so I love that the contemplation of like, listen, anything that needs your time and attention, whether you like it or not, is still a demand. Of course, we want more positive demands than negative demands, I think, but they still count. And then on the supply side, So can we talk through what are some examples? And the thing I love about your book in particular is that it is about building a personal plan. So it's not this, here's a one size fits all, here's what you need to do, here's what your supply should be. It really is a personal exercise that you walk people through. But some examples for listeners. So working out, what are some other things that you might see on that supply side that helps replenish some of that energy that's taken away?
Sometimes people will list their conversation with their coach, for example. They may list a moment where they were forced to wait somewhere and just decided to enjoy the view. They may list, any element of exercise. Sometimes meditation will be there. Sometimes there will be this one moment they plan once a year with their partner to have this special date or a special weekend, that kind of thing. Sometimes it will be a moment where they were mentoring someone who now has gone on and done fabulous things on their own. And so that was just a very nice source of supply of energy. So these are examples. Sometimes it will be a moment where they've decided, for whatever reason, when they were interrupted by their young child while working from home, to actually leave the computer entirely and step out and go see what's happening with, their toy at that moment, and realizing how wonderful that felt. It varies, but it's looking at, usually recent, past week or two, the kinds of things that you've done that have added to your energy.
Ladies, imagine taking time away to work on you. Meditation, yoga, transformational work, a chance to have grand adventures and build lasting relationships. Desiree Garcia and I founded High Vibe Tribe Retreats to create just that. And if you're curious about joining us on our next retreat, head over to highvibetriberetreat.com, link in the show notes. I love this, moments of presence and awareness, which that requires consciousness in itself, right? To sort of be like, I was present enough to notice this moment, to enjoy this dinner, to be present that this gave me energy and I was aware that it was energy filling. And I think, a lot of times we're just so busy going through the motions that this exercise you're talking about gives people a really great chance to take a step back and ask themselves truly, what is feeding my energy? And then being able to now know like, oh, okay, so there's a bit of I use the word formula very loosely, but there's something to this. Like, so how can I plan for this? How do I get more of this in my life? I think you already mentioned that there's no specific ratio, but is there something, let's say someone's doing this exercise and all of a sudden they're seeing 50 demands on one side of the page and only about 5 things on the supply. Is there, sort of a piece to keep in mind? Do we want to have double on one side, or what do you recommend?
Well, I would say, actually, your next step then, once you've got this, is to do the other piece of work that I'm recommending, which is that sort of equivalent of SWOT analysis for yourself. Because before you can, and we feel sometimes like it, right? It's just jumping to, what's my next action given this kind of thing. But the reality, and that's often what actually keeps people who actually really want to do this from implementing, is the reality of their context. And that's why the SWOT analysis is so important, looking at, in my current context, from my personality, what helps? I value resilience. I want to. I'm really motivated, for example. What is not helping? I tend to say yes. And right now, given my career stage or given my business stage, it feels like I have to. So I'm sort of saying yes. In my external context, what is helping? Well, I live in an area, say, where I can actually just step outside and walk if I want to. It's doable. I don't have to drive, for example. Okay. And external context, what may be challenging, we're just being acquired right now. And so this is possibly the most demanding time of my entire business story right now. So that this is the context. See, that's important because that will look very different for this person than it would for someone else. And so given this, even if the list of demands is, let's say, very large compared to the list of supply, we're still not going to try to shift half of this. This is way too much. It's impossible. It's just impossible. And if we actually try, all that's going to happen is we're not going to succeed. And now we will beat ourselves up for the fact that we're also not doing this. None of this is helpful. Instead, the reality of these steps will guide the person to maybe identify one thing on the supply front that needs to shift. Because if the list of demands is that long and the list of supply is that short, it's not just about balancing it by adding more on the supply front. We probably need to tweak here. There's just too much. Like there's not enough minutes in the day to create enough supply to change that feeling overall. It's just too much. And so we'll focus on one thing.
What a good exercise because, okay, raise your hand, listeners, if you've ever overcommitted. If you have listened to a podcast or read a book and were really inspired and thought, you know what? Screw the 5 a.m. club. I'm going to be a part of the 4 a.m. club and I'm going to run every morning and I'm going to meditate and then I'm going to read Marcus Aurelius and then I'm going to journal and then I'm going to pack my lunch. And now all of a sudden these things that are meant to feed us become a demand. That's what I'm hearing you say. Image is like, hey, if we don't have the bandwidth, we can't just magically add all of these extra things and think that it's going to give us that supply. In truth, if we don't have the bandwidth, the supply becomes more demand. So wow, I needed to hear that because I would have been guilty of adding 15 things to balance it out and then feeling disappointed that I didn't have all of the time and energy to give to those 15 things.
Right? I know. I've been there as well. I mean, it's something that would have worked earlier in our lives. Like in the first, there is such a thing as adult development. Sometimes we think it's just child, adolescent, and adult. No, within adulthood, we are also developing. And life looks different, even though it varies from person to person in the first decade, second, and so on. So that logic of adding more supply probably worked better in our 20s because we had, by default, less demands. They were not as large for most people. It's not always the case, but generally speaking. And so, yeah, adding more probably worked. Plus, the overall body, brain, everything was younger and had more energy in it. So that maybe worked there, but it will not work for all the decades that follow. We need to adapt.
Yeah, great advice. And the last piece is actions. And I would imagine this is the place, as you mentioned, when you kind of had to take a step back and you're like, wait, we've got to do this SWOT analysis first. We've got to kind of figure out what your internal and external circumstances are, because people often, when we want to problem solve, we just want to jump straight to actions. Just tell me what to do. And there are many steps that are there, but in these actions of what to do next, what's the process you walk people through so they can find the actions that are specific to them? And what their next, I'm going to say baby step. That's for the high achievers listening. What's the right next baby step to take? Because not everything has to be that giant leap like we were talking about.
No, it really does not. Here, what we're after is, and the term that we would use is in, say, psychology, literature kind of thing, is self-efficacy. So the approach here is that we're building the plan such that we have really high chances of doing the thing, and therefore we will more likely do it. And when we do that small next action that was doable and realistic given everything, we're increasing that belief that we can influence this. That's that sense of self-efficacy. And we know from research that the more we build this, the more we build the belief that we can influence things, these kinds of things moving forward. And that's optimism. And the more we build this, the more we build the belief we can influence other things also in the future, and that's agency. And so what we're really after are those absolutely doable next steps that we feel like doing because they're aligned with our values. So for example, let's say you value all these things of health, family, relationships. Okay. And you've looked at your long list of demands, short list of supply. You've looked at your challenges. It's hard to fit in anything new. Okay, what do we do? So similar to in business, when we build a strategy, first you're going for strategic pillars. So key overall direction that you'd like to invest in. So let's say we're going with this example I was just using. It may be that one pillar will be health. I want to invest even more in my health. Okay, fine. And you're going to go for an action that is extremely doable. For example, Okay, well, I realize meditation is on the list, has been for a long time. I've tried, doesn't work, whatever. I'm just going to make sure I take 5 deep breaths when I'm washing my hands. That's it. It's not involving more time. Yay for that. It requires conscious focus. It builds that habit. And it's using this time, which I have to do anyway. It's healthy, very doable. Okay. Maybe there will be another pillar that's called family. And maybe there, my one action is, if I work from home and my door is open, someone comes in, partner, child, whoever lives with you, and they come in, I will make sure I stand up immediately from my desk and step out and talk to them. So it's not just like, wait a sec. I'm stepping out because that's one of my values. I love these people. If the door is open, that means I can be interrupted. So honor this. And you build your pillars like this. Sometimes people will realize that one of the things that stresses them out is they say yes to everything and they underestimate how much time it takes them to do things, which many of us do. So there could be a pillar about better estimating time. And your only action is once a week, you identify one thing that you predict how long it's going to take, and then you time it. So I think responding to Amy's message is going to take me a minute, start the clock, and then I respond. And of course, well, now I have more ideas as I'm responding to Amy, and I want to say something about her podcast. And now I looked up her profile also. So it's been 15 minutes. That's what it takes me to send a good message. Okay, so next time, no, think it's 1 minute. It's 15. And these are my 3 actions. Just better estimating time. That would be the third one there. So you see how we didn't change my life. We didn't give me massively high objectives that I'm unlikely to meet. There is things in there that I can very likely do, like the breathing while I'm washing my hands, for example.
I love the simplification of it. And also just the coming back to what is important, what is important, what is important. Again, instead of just what is needed of me, that is how many of us, what is needed of me, what is needed of me, what is the, and then how many of us have heard like the, I don't have time, to do anything that really fills us up because we're so busy in the demands of the world around us and just being able to take a step back and being very strategic. And then I think it gives you a great plan for the future because the present is the present. It was based on how we behaved in the past that has gotten us to this place. And so maybe we do have these demands, some of them of our own doing. Something I'm really passionate about is teaching people how to own their shit. And I say that with love, but I mean that in what do I really control? What do I really control? And living in what we truly control. Because a lot of times we're living and trying to, pull the levers on things that are out of our control. So which your exercise is so great to say, what are those external circumstances? I can't control if the company is being bought. I can't control the traffic, but there are some things that I can control. And then based on those, how do I then behave in a way that gets me in a better place in the future? If someone is really MH, if they come to you and they're like, I'm really struggling. I'm really burned out. I need something now. I need like a rescue plan. Is it like, great, follow these 4, go through the top 4, follow your strategic plan, or is there any additional advice you would throw in for them?
Well, I would say, and of course, then I would ask more questions about where they're at and all, but truly, if you feel like you're at the bottom of your tank, like, you've listened to this today, on one hand, it sounds good. On the other hand, you're like, there's nothing I've got nothing. Then I would say, let go of all this. What you're doing now is connecting with your physical health service provider, your physician or nurse practitioner, and you're connecting with someone on the mental health side. You can start with your coach. Just sometimes they'll have a good recommendation for who to connect to. Otherwise, you can connect with a psychologist or using your employee and family assistance program. The reason I say this is when we're at the bottom of our tank, which does happen to a lot of executives and business owners, because sometimes things happen so fast and so intensely over a period of time that there's just no choice. That you just realize you're here when you're here. You go from, but sometimes people will tell me, being the rock to being the wreck, like over here. And then I would say, yes, it's time to really, really connect with resources instead of trying to do it on your own. Because sometimes the way you feel could be connected to something physical, like a low-functioning thyroid gland, for example, that just needs attention. And we're too tired by then to even think. And so then I would say we're connecting with resources so that you get your people around you. Similar to, business is in trouble. Somehow it has gone faster than you don't have the resources. You're getting your consultants, right? Same thing there.
That's great advice, because I have certainly been there. And even in doing work that I loved, I have still, hit a wall and just been, very depleted because the demands are around me. And in hindsight, when I look back, I have to say that I do think many times burnout has been a byproduct of me abandoning myself. And in that, with your plan, it gave more definition to that, being like, oh, you know what? It was abandoning my values or abandoning those pillars that are so important to identify. So then we can move into action. But when we're in that emergency state, I love that you're like, don't go it alone. Call somebody along the way. That's great advice. So the plan is, I think this is so great for people to read and be able to come in and do some self-advocacy for people who are listening, who are like, this is great. I want to do this for me, but how can I be a better resilience encourager for people who work for me? Let's say it's leaders and they're like, dang, I want to make sure that I'm not, causing burnout or what have you. What recommendation do you have for those people who want to be good resources alongside their folks?
Yes. Well, it's funny you say this. Just in the past few weeks, Inc. Named my book one of the 5 books to buy for your teams. I designed it a bit that way so that, and you've seen at the end of each chapter, we've got questions so we can have conversations. You can use them as your own self-reflection, but you can talk to your team about it. Book clubs in organizations have used it also for that reason. But also, even without the book, one of the things that we can all do more, and I would say, especially as AI comes in our work and lives even more, it's always been a core component of good leadership to connect, check in, communicate, ask how people are doing. And it will continue to be even more important as we add to our teams, sometimes an AI partner. And so all the reasons are there to potentially consider checking in with your team members even more. So, and sometimes for very busy executives and leaders, I say literally, how what gets measured gets done. Create a tracking system for yourself to make a note that you've checked. Because you may have the best intentions, you may value it, yes. And then you realize it's been 3 months. And so sometimes it's just a check mark, to make sure that you've done it. But that way it serves as a way to commit to yourself that you're really checking in and reminding people of the resources we have access to if they say, I'm struggling. If it is something that you can help with, like talking about workload, for example, you can do this. But you do want to check in. And if you're not a leader, you can also volunteer to your leader how you're feeling. Sometimes for the same reasons, that conversation is just not occurring right now. You can bring it forward. It's their job to have visibility on how the team's doing.
I think that just leaders who are leaning in and caring about this, thank you. Well done. I mean, it's important that people feel like they have a safe space to bring this. I'm always a fan, as simple as this is, of a 1 to 10 scale. I've used it with, folks on my team. I've used it with clients. And you could say anything like, hey, scale of 1 to 10, 1 being terrible, 10 being greatest. How's your mental bandwidth right now? Or how connected are you feeling with the team? Or, how engaged are you in your work? You could ask a million things. And honestly, the number they give you is not what matters, right? It just, if somebody says 7, okay, tell me why 7. What does that mean to you? What's the gap between 7 and 10? The numbers themselves are not important, but the chance for them to talk about it and to be able to, kind of give some concrete, definitions of where they are, I feel like that can be really helpful. So I love that suggestion. Check in with them. You are right. If, what's scheduled and you can't change what's not measured. So being able to put that on your goal list as a leader, one of your own measurements for success, I think is really great. So as we wrap up today, you and your team have been so gracious in sharing some great resources. I know that we're going to have some of those in the show notes of things to download. That exercise with supply and demand is going to be in there. Can you share with the listeners some other ways that they can connect with you?
Yes. Well, they can go to theresilienceplan.com. They'll see all kinds of things there, conversations, media, articles that I've written or contributed to, and of course, all the things that I do and all. Always happy to hear from people on LinkedIn. That's a great place for also me to see the work you're doing, support you. So I'm valuing that as well. And yes, we will have the free worksheets link. We'll send that to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Lots of great takeaways today.
Thank you, Amy. It was an absolute pleasure.
Before we wrap up this episode, here are my 3 takeaways and how we can incorporate them into our lives. Number 1, resilience is not a personality trait. Gosh, did I need to hear this? And I think many of us need this reminder. It's not a matter of are you resilient or are you not? There is a way to build this muscle within. And so that reminder is a simple one, but I think it's much needed, that it's not a matter of you have it or you don't. It's a matter of, are we setting ourselves up for success in order to achieve more of it? Number 2, positive demands still count. I am so guilty of thinking that if I just put more positive demands on my to-do list, then it's going to outweigh any of the supply I might need to bring to the table. And I've really tried to structure my business around more positive demands. I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se, except with what MH had mentioned to us. They still count. They don't just go away just because they're positive. We've got to add that to the list too. A good reminder for you and for me that, resilience is needed in all times, even times when we're doing things that we like. And number 3, baby steps. That SWOT analysis was so helpful for her to walk us through of just looking at what is the reality before me before I jump in and try and add on even more things that I'm committing to doing. What do I really have the bandwidth for? What can I really say yes to right now? What are the pillars that I deem to be important? How can I just be very specific and break those down and then lean into tiny actions? Baby steps can be just as impactful as giant leaps. Sometimes we just need to start somewhere so that we can begin to give ourselves more supply than demands. Thanks for listening to the Conscious Habit Podcast. If you dug this episode, we'd love it if you would subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And if you're into this consciousness thing, if you like this conversation and you want to meet more like-minded people, head on over to Facebook and join the Conscious Habit community. Until next time, do the world a favor and go love yourself.